Just wanted to plug this piece by Alex Shepard, who we've had on the show before and is a really good writer over at the New Republic. His first few paragraphs of this piece, I think, just like summarize this past 2 weeks pretty well. Elon Musk, the world's richest man, has seized control of the Treasury Department. He's deciding who the government pays and who it doesn't. The federal payment system he has access to contains the social security numbers and even the bank account information of nearly every American. It also has information about Musk's private sector competitors that he can now use for his own self-enrichment. Musk has given a handful of inexperienced young coders control over this sensitive system where they can, and reportedly have, started to mess with its code. At least one of them is not even old enough to drink. This hostile takeover of the finances of the United States This is a hostile takeover of the finances of the United States government. It's blatantly unconstitutional. It's a coup. It sounds like the treatment from a Gerard Butler action flick. That's not all. Trump and Musk have shut down the United States Agency for International Development and cut off nearly all foreign aid. This will have devastating consequences for global health, global democracy, and the future of American soft power. Speaking of, Trump has spent the early days of his presidency threatening 25% tariffs against Mexico and Canada for no real reason other than that he thinks it's a tool that worked more than a century ago will work now. It won't. Even if he doesn't end up enacting these tariffs, which would likely be a form of economic suicide, he has already likely damaged the future of any trade agreement between the U.S. and its closest allies. He has also pardoned over 1,000 violent insurrectionists and now seems ready to fire hundreds of FBI agents who helped prosecute them. But there's more. The administration is freezing funding for climate and infrastructure spending, despite numerous court orders. Trump just released a ton of water into California's Central Valley in a publicity stunt.
That couldn't possibly get to L.A.
All he's accomplished is screwing over farmers who will likely need that water in the summer. It did absolutely nothing to fight the mostly contained fires that devastated the state last month.
Because those drain into San Francisco.
Right. Well, he's so dumb, too. And they did it.
Yep.
His administration is waging an all-out war against trans people and seems on the verge of all but ending gender-affirming care for minors. As I write this, American planes are flying migrants to Guantanamo Bay, where they will be held in a concentration camp. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, supposedly one of the normal people in the administration, just reached an agreement with El Salvador where it will accept deportees of all nationalities, including Americans. I mean, people just should check out the full piece. It's great. But on that point, last night, a reporter from the Miami Herald came out with a story. This is just a tweet, but she broke this story. Clara Sophia Daly, I retweeted it, Bradley. I mean, it's not necessary that you put it up, but some MAGA idiots were claiming, oh, you're reporting this without any evidence. She's a reporter. She's an education reporter at the Miami Herald. Do you think that she didn't do her due diligence? But like, we're in the post-truth world, and all they need to do is throw out a smear and then they feel okay. A middle school science teacher in Miami-Dade was detained by ICE. The Miami-Dade Teachers Union confirmed today that the teacher attended his immigration hearing and was detained. He has been in the U.S. since his youth and had DACA. He will likely be deported.
Revealing that these freaks would deny something like that when actually it's what they're calling for.
They say that he's a criminal for being a DACA recipient, for being a child that was a dreamer who is legally in the United States under that program. Legally. But you see how Sam did a really good job the other day of saying like what they're doing with these classifications. So if you're a member of a gang, we don't really need to prove it, but we'll say you're a member of the gang anyway. You're a terrorist, so we can put you in Guantanamo Bay. Gang members normally, they would be prosecuted within our own judicial system. But for immigrants, you're actually a terrorist. Okay, so that removes all their rights. And then they can go to Guantanamo Bay and be housed in this concentration camp. But they also need to house criminals in the concentration camp, right? So you got the terrorists in the concentration camp, and then you got the criminals. And for MAGA, the criminals are classified as anybody who is not a natural born citizen in the United States. And even then, Trump's trying to target that with an executive order that, frankly, thankfully, has been blocked by 2 federal judges at this point, and we'll see how that process goes. But this is a local news report on immigration raids in the Denver area now. Now, you'll recall one of the apartment complexes that is highlighted here and was the subject of these deportations arrests is the Edge of Lowry. That was one of the apartment complexes that was falsely deemed by the slumlord that owns it to distract from the fact that he had been neglecting the tenants there. He claimed to a bunch of media sources and to the Republican politicians in the area that it had been taken over by Tren de Aragua, the gang. And that was a way for him to distract from what I just said.
It would totally not be a slum if the damn gang wasn't there,
right,
intimidating me.
And it was a mass attempt to deflect from his own malfeasance. And stories like with Target blaming crime for the closure of their stores in certain areas, and then you find out 6 months later that internally it was because they made bad business decisions and they weren't. It wasn't crime and shoplifting that was cutting into their profits. It was their own bad decisions. But it's easy to blame that, right? It was the same thing with this slumlord. Blame immigrants. Blame the hordes of people that you're supposed to be housing, because then people don't have to look into your own business practices. Punch down. That's conservatism. And so now this particular complex is back in the news. Here's Kyle Clark. He's done some good reporting, one of the few local news reporters that seems to try to get it right.
He's a really, really good local news reporter. He also is, if we recall, was a very prudent and a discerning questioner of Lauren Boebert at her congressional primary debate about the Beetlejuice incident and other things. He's really good at his job.
He is covering that this immigration bust. So this is his monologue and reporting on what's been happening.
This week's big immigration bust was a bust, if you judge it by the Fed's own goals and the results announced today by Fox News Channel. ICE agents said they were going after 100 members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua in Denver and Aurora yesterday. Now, while the feds refused to tell journalists just how many arrests they made and how many of them were TDA members, the Fox News reporter embedded with agents said they only made 30 arrests. And just one was a TDA member. Fox News and the Trump administration are now blaming local media outlets for the lack of success.
It certainly felt like everybody knew this was coming, including the targets and the local media.
There were some leaks from local media that tipped off the local activists on the ground, and it made your jobs difficult.
We've already identified how this operation got leaked. I'll deal with that today.
Immigrant communities in Denver and Aurora have been expecting yesterday's raids ever since Donald Trump campaigned on a promise that he would start his mass deportation here. Many of the properties involved in the raids were also no-brainers. They're linked to CBZ Management, the landlords that made national headlines by claiming takeovers by the Venezuelan gang.
Ding, ding, ding.
And as those raids played out publicly for hours yesterday, community members and activists gathered to heckle agents from afar, shouting legal advice to the people inside apartments as agents went door to door asking people for their papers.
I was scolded by other members of the media that I was overlooking the will of the people in the area,
right?
By downplaying the dastardly gangs and the poor, helpless slumlord.
Well, it was Anna Kasparian.
Turns out that people actually think this is bullshit.
Yeah. It's interesting. Was there any did you ever follow up to see if they retracted the story that they did that just basically regurgitated what the landlord said?
No, they doubled down and said that actually they were right about stuff without really fully addressing, say, the work that Jose Nottinjay did in nailing them dead to rights.
Yeah, that video essay is phenomenal and shows how
Probably
much misinformation.
500,000 views by this point. Let me check.
Check over there if you want more about this Aurora gang story in particular. But they arrested one Tren de Aragua member. That was the figure that was given.
And it would have been more if it wasn't for those meddling kids.
And the dastardly media alerting people to this, because
We better collapse the media. We better just make it illegal to talk about ICE and stuff now.
hey, Elon's on board or whatever. I mean, this is what the administration. Yeah, I mean, we got to see both sides here. And by the way, this program is brought to you live from the Biden-Harris studios in Brooklyn. Anyway, let's keep going.
Advice to the people inside apartments as agents went door to door asking people for their papers. Today, Trump supporters Tom Homan threatened federal prosecutions for people he says are impeding their operations. Now, the feds say they were targeting violent criminals. We continue to ask just how many of the people arrested in Colorado yesterday were violent criminals, as opposed to people who had civil immigration violations and were picked up because they couldn't show papers. Homan suggested...
That's a nice distinction for a media professional to make, and not just take the word of it from the fascist administration that they want to pander to.
More of this. Like, I've been screaming. The New York Times did have a piece where they, talked about the discrepancy in, like, I guess earlier this week, it was around 88,000 folks that ICE had said that they'd rounded up, and only a few dozen claims have been made via the ICE social media platform that those folks were criminals. So even if you take all of what ICE said and claimed on social media at face value, that these, 24, 36 people that they're highlighting, say even 50 are criminals, that's a pretty big gap with the 8,000. And I just said to you that a dreamer DACA recipient who's been in this country for most of his life and is a middle school teacher in Miami-Dade County was just rounded up by ICE. Criminals.
Who had civil immigration violations and were picked up because they couldn't show papers. Homan suggested today that the lack of success in this week's raids means more non-criminals will be arrested in the future.
We go on these operations, the operation got leaked somehow, it makes us less successful. Again, when you leak an operation, it means more bad guys are not being arrested, which means more bad guys are walking the streets. So as we address that, you're going to see the arrests increase. As the aperture opens up beyond criminals, you're going to see more arrests.
Well, great job, Kyle Clark. That's right. And there's just so much, cruelty that's already being highlighted. Again, I feel like there's a gap with some of this reporting, because people who are here without documentation are terrified of any attention that's going to be put on them right now. So that's part of what Homan and these fascists are relying on, is just like this idea that these are people who are already terrified of having their lives uprooted. So they're not going to speak to the press for the most part. And there was another report out of Austin in Cedar Park that there was a teenager who entered the U.S. through a legal pathway, detained by ICE, a teenager with no criminal record, seemingly rounded up in Austin.
Yeah, and when it comes to this sort of thing, all of this really does is help the Republicans attack sanctuary city laws, which are uncontroversially make cities less safe in a very basic way that, frankly, any child could understand, which is that if there are people committing crimes, regardless of their documented status, you should be able to tell the cops about it so that community isn't victimized by those people. And all this stuff adding to, and the GOP can't have that, because two things that they can't really tolerate, which is a sane policy regarding non-citizens as part of society that don't need to be expelled using a giant military force called ICE. And what's the second one? B, safe cities. Safe cities are bad propaganda for the right wing. And that's why you have a whole bunch of people in media that want to inflate how unsafe exactly cities are. And so you have all this stuff focused on New York, blue state cities, because this is partisan. Never mind that, say, Kansas City, Missouri, or even Missouri, excluding Kansas City, has higher violent crime rates than the city that I'm in right now. But none of these people give a fuck about that. They don't give a fuck that there's a whole bunch of violence, particularly in the South, and like freedom of guns and like lack of development and all that sort of stuff. They only see this as a football to push reactionary politics. And
yeah, the city thing is really important too, because they attack, and it usually it's also leaders of color that they're particularly targeting. I mean, you don't have to be Karen Bass's #1 fan to see that like a lot of the fixation on her from the right is about her gender and her race. And when they say big blue cities, that's what they mean. I mean, we played, that guy's name always escapes me, that podcaster who talked about tech Zionism yesterday.
Balaji Srinivasan, I think.
Balaji Srinivasan. He said that he was, because apparently he's ethnically conservative or non-liberal. I don't know
he's
how.
A gray.
He's a gray. So he's been ethnically cleansed from San Francisco. What does it mean to be a gray?
So he says the reds are like conservatives who want to go back to the 50s, and blues are like, you know, people who have pronouns in bio, and grays are the tech people. And I would just say the blues and the reds should team up on the grays.
Yeah, I want to ethnically cleanse those grays.
I think like it was. I think Jeb Bush said we should have a recession in Washington D.C. And you know a lot of people pointed out like, well, D.C. is a very black city. That would be bad for particularly black people. But what he meant was basically what Republicans are doing right now, which is going after the administration. We should want to cut down venture capital to basically being a second afterthought.
You made a great point about the other day on Twitter about the being basically analogous to the trusts that were busted prior to the the Great Depression.
Yeah, Frederick Lewis Allen has a book from the 1930s or something like that, written during the height of the New Deal, when they thought we had turned back capitalism, free marketism for good, and it goes into all of the sort of like early 20th century consolidation, where people with too much money would give it to somebody like JP Morgan or whatever, and they would end up doing all of the investing for it. It's similar to private equity. The main difference is the robber barons of that time, like Morgan or Harriman, knew a lot more about the fundamental industries that they were monopolizing than any of these private equity freaks.
I mean, they were sociopaths, but like at the very least, they built things.
They knew how to build railroads.
Right. Now we just have, guys on ketamine and Adderall.
Building chatbots.
Right, like tinkering with algorithms and being antisocial. God. Didn't think we'd long for the robber barons with a little bit more like respectability than these just weirdos.
Andrew Carnegie sitting at Davos with that guy who's trying to DH himself.
Yeah.
And the Juicero CEO.
We are not the same. We are not the same.
And all these guys.
What do you build?
All these guys talking about philanthropy. Like, imagine how much money it would cost to do like the Carnegie libraries across the entire country. None of these guys doing any of that shit.
Hey folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.